In this HelpNet security video, I'll be talking about how financial organizations are failing to act despite the majority experiencing a firmware-related breach. When we think about financial organizations, they are clearly those that are the most under attack by adversaries of all kinds, whether they're financially motivated gangs and organizations or whether they're nation-state attackers. What we don't tend to see often is that the focus of many of these attacks is in firmware. It's in the fact that firmware is embedded in every device used throughout the financial organizations and all of their supply chains. And we really see this tension between the fact that there is this attack surface everywhere in firmware, highly motivated adversaries, whether those are, again, nation-state criminals or organized gangs. And between those forces, caught in this grip is the financial services CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, who is responsible for protecting data, information, and systems in those financial organizations. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, has for the last 20 years been collecting data on known exploited vulnerabilities, not just the thousands of vulnerabilities that we know about in application services and code, but those that are actively exploited. And if you break that data apart into classes, you start seeing the sort of attacks that you would expect to see: web browser focused attacks. You see attacks in virtualization. You see attacks focused on software libraries. As we get further into the present day, through the early 2000s and into the teens, as it were, we start seeing a lot of server-side attacks. We obviously see OS-level attacks. But what surprises a lot of observers is that the majority of attacks, especially going back to 2005, are occurring in firmware, that code that's not accessible by the end user, that's embedded by the manufacturer, that's delivered with the devices that we use to deliver our financial services. This surprises most people. And in fact, when you look at the total counts of areas of known exploited vulnerabilities over the last 20 years, firmware leads the pack, actually. It's what's driving the up and to the right motion of known exploited vulnerabilities and where most of those are occurring. And we see that in our news as well. We don't see that just in sort of an academic view from CISA, but we see it sort of boots on the ground as well. A report came out from Ars Technica earlier this summer looking at the discovery of a UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface Rootkit. And the article had an interesting headline to it. It exposes an ugly truth. These attacks are invisible to us. And that was a very true point in that article, as firmware was designed and built to be unobservable and unobtrusive and running at the highest privileged place in the stack effectively, but also to be beyond user control. But it's not just in UEFI attacks. We're looking at it in chip-level exploits. The cyber criminals now looking to exploit the Intel Management Engine vulnerabilities that creates these highly persistent implants, as pointed out by CSO magazine earlier this summer. And then with the attack commencing, Russia's attack on the Ukraine commencing earlier this year, one of the first things they did for those endpoints is target new data wiper malware at them that was largely driven by firmware embedded code to take those endpoints offline. But we also see it in network devices as well. We've seen firmware level attacks looking at Cisco router vulnerabilities being actively exploited. Of course, we saw the Pulse Secure attacks of last year. Just this year, actually, again, this summer, a number of unpatched F5 vulnerabilities under active attack, all of that being in firmware within the F5 devices. And then systems like the Fortinet 40OS, which is their operating system, if you will, for their devices, all delivered through firmware in those systems. So we see it in endpoints and we see it in network devices. We also see it in servers. Some of the most potent attacks that we've seen lately really target baseboard management components, which are unique to servers, that deliver or compromise things like the pants down vulnerability for QCT or Quanta servers, or also in the baseboard management controllers that are run in HPE servers using their integrated lights out system for BMC control. Their ILO bleed was the result of that attack. So effectively, we see these attacks really across all of our infrastructure. We see it in endpoints, we see it in servers, we see it in network devices. And it's largely because there's so much firmware in these components. There are 15 to 20 firmware components in every single endpoint, 30 or more in every server. And then, of course, every network device comes with its own firmware embedded in it. This report, recently released from Vanson Bourne, looked at this question of what do cybersecurity decision makers think about firmware? Whose responsibility do they see it as being? How do they see this trend in firmware-based exploits? And try to map this out across all the decision makers that are really in financial services organizations, talking to CISOs, talking to the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, directors of endpoint security, directors of vulnerability management. In May 2022, this survey went to 350 decision makers in IT security organizations that are specifically working in financial services. Every organization had to have a minimum of at least 1,000 employees. And the report wanted to do a pretty fair review across all geographies. It looked at North America, it looked at Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and Malaysia in a fairly mixed sample set. And then, of course, all the respondents were from organizations in financial services. And as we unpack that data and start looking at it, one of the first questions that came to the top was, have you been attacked via firmware? Has your organization been victim of a firmware level attack in the last 2 years? And a couple of the respondents said, no, this has never happened. But it might surprise people to hear that not only has it happened once, but a majority of respondents said that yes, at least twice or more. In fact, the total was 88% were aware that their organization had been the victim of a firmware level attack just in the last 2 years. This information surprises a lot of people. There's this understanding or this perception that firmware level attacks are really just the province of, again, nation state attackers and things like Stuxnet, which were really targeted at major exploits or major compromises. But really what we're going to uncover in this report is how this firmware is working, firmware level based attacks working its way into sort of the run-of-the-mill attacks and exploits. The question was, is there an awareness gap? Do IT security decision makers in financial services have gaps in their awareness concerning a firmware blind spot? Is there a firmware blind spot? 76% of IT security decision makers saw that there wasn't a gap in their understanding of firmware, their ability to see firmware, track it, identify it in their systems, verify that it's the right firmware, and fortify it. And this happened because of some common mistakes. 81% thought that their vulnerability management solution was to some degree capable of solving their firmware security problem. And 83% thought their endpoint detection or their XDR solution could help them solve their firmware security problems. Unfortunately, this is almost never the case because firmware was running below the operating system at the hardware layer. And of course, vulnerability management solutions and EDR and XDR solutions are really built to protect systems really at the operating system and the applications and above. The firmware layer is foreign to them, and it's a different kind of code and different kinds of components. We also saw, as the respondents started understanding what it would take to get ahead of their firmware security needs in financial services organizations, 93% thought that they would need an increase in their overall financial investment in both tooling and solutions. And 89% thought that they would need an increase in staffing and human resources to get ahead of these problems in firmware security, to close this firmware security gap, if you will. This is an interesting piece of data as well. Just largely because of the overlap that already exists in thinking that certain controls already provide them with some level of firmware. But once they understand how pervasive firmware is and how present it is in endpoints and in servers and in network devices, the actual increase needed, the increase in their overall staffing and in their tooling to get ahead of that problem really revealed that this is a blind spot. This is a big gap in ways to cover attack surface. So who is better? This is one of the questions that led off the survey in the first place. But 92% believe that adversaries are better at compromising firmware than defenders are at protecting it. This actually drove some interesting dialogue from the respondents to the survey, where questions came up. You could just find them on Reddit. Is it really that easy to just download a firmware rootkit off of the internet? And the answer was a resounding yes. If you look at the responses back to Reddit threads like this, while it's been sort of a black box for the defenders in terms of trusting the firmware that's locked into their endpoints and their servers and their network devices, it's been cracked open, if you will, and actively pursued by adversaries looking to find new ways to exploit those systems. And this pointed to the this appearance of a sophisticated UEFI rootkit that came from a Chinese origin, showing up again and again and again 3 years after being discovered. Another question was, where is firmware? Where do I actually find firmware in my infrastructure and what I've deployed? This is an interesting question because in reality, firmware is everywhere in the organization. Virtually every one of these components listed here has firmware. The majority of respondents, though, really said, yeah, it's in security controls. The security controls I use, like next-gen firewalls, access equipment, and in my network devices. And really zero, nobody specifically identified all of the devices that we rely on in IT security, especially in financial services organizations, really come with vulnerable, exploitable firmware. Another focus of the survey was really looking about threat management. So as threat hunters go out and actively try to find threats that are being run in their environment at that particular time, what was the percentage that believed that their modeling exercises needed to include firmware level threats, that basically needed to include firmware based IOCs or indicators of compromise? 94% believe that their threat modeling exercises have to include firmware level threats. But the reality is there's a long way to go. If you looked at these two areas of needing significant improvement or notable improvement is required, that was the majority of the responses, almost 80% of the responses for all of these questions, needing improvement in threat modeling exercises, in the relevancy of threat modeling exercises to the current threat landscape that's leveraging firmware-based attacks, modeling attacks at the device level, or doing incident playbooks that also respond to destructive attacks. Firmware's a very good tool for enabling complete destruction, like in the example of those firmware wipers discussed in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So even at the level of doing threat detection and analysis, there's this large perceived gap, a large gap in understanding. So who needs this information? Who needs to possess this information about how firmware security is viewed in financial services organizations? Well, we might argue that if your role is any of these, if you're a threat analyst, obviously if you're a CISO, but if you're a security solutions architect building and designing solutions to try to protect your organization, we think you need to know more about firmware-based exploits. If you're the director of endpoint security or in charge of vulnerability management or network security, firmware needs to come into your purview. It needs to come into your sort of your wheelhouse, and people need to start getting an understanding of it. Thank you very much.